In all of the prior videos in this series, man, I've had a blast walking through the decade of the 1980s and lifting up and featuring the albums that I personally believe are the ones that have had a real significant impact on the genre of Christian hard rock and metal music. In this final video, I'm going to feature the bands and albums that from 1988 through 1990-ish, we'll probably take a couple steps into the 90s here and there, maybe even the 21st century in a couple places, just to round this whole thing out. We're going to feature those specific albums and bands that I believe have had the biggest impact on Christian rock and metal music. Of course, I know that all of this is from my little perspective, and I'm going to miss some that you think, oh, dude, he should have mentioned this band or that one or whatever. Add them, okay? Jump in the comments and share them with the community. And also, if you have some really cool trivia or points of information about any of the bands or artists or albums that I mentioned, man, be sure to drop those down in the comments as well. All right, man, I'm fired up. I'm looking forward to making this last video in this series a really good one. Let's do it. Rocking you up for Jesus Christ with classic style hard rock music and practical Bible teaching. All right, guys, this is going to be crazy rapid fire. I've got 8 honorable mentions to share with you, and then I've got 14 bands, and in several of those cases, several albums, or at least a couple albums with each of those bands. So I'm going to do my best to make this as succinct as possible. These are in no particular order, except for the fact that I'm going to start with the honorable mentions first, and then go to the featured bands and albums. So let's just jump in with these 8 honorable mentions. Because this is the last video I'm making in this series, I had to pull the Brave in, okay? Their debut didn't come out till 1992. But they are right down the middle of the lane of this style of, just classic hard rock and metal music. Love their stuff. You've got to check out The Brave if you haven't before. They've got a great discography, man. Second is Daryl Mansfield. The guy is just a bedrock, foundational piece of classic Christian hard rock and metal. He was prolific. He's got albums throughout the decade of the 80s and even spans both sides of it. So you got to check out Daryl Mansfield. Next is Rez Band. And notice I'm featuring bands here because all of these bands, except for the ones that I specifically mentioned, had albums that came out around this time period of 88 to 90. I just think it's worth just lifting up the bands and saying, go check out their discography. Rez Band were incredibly prolific. They were pros. They were pioneers in this field. Check them out. And then, of course, the grandfathers of Christian rock, Petra, man. They started in 1974, and around 1988, 89, they were just getting things really humming with John Schlitt. I remember I saw Petra live for the very first time with John Schlitt on the On Fire tour, which came out in, I believe, 88 or 89. They had come to Reardon Auditorium, a really cool kind of in-the-round auditorium, sat about 3,000 people. So cool. I'm assuming if you're watching this video, you are totally aware of Petra, but man, check out their discography. It's massive. Next honorable mention is a band that I just genuinely love, but they're one of those bands that kind of came and went and weren't around long enough to really, get to know. Tempest. Tempest put out 2 albums in the late 80s. 1987, they put out A Coming Storm. 1988, they put out The Eye of the Storm. Both of them were on Pure Metal. They are classic 80s metal, man. They are so worth checking out. Tempest. Crystavox is another one of those bands, man. They came along. They put out 2 really cool albums in 90 and 92. They just didn't stick around long enough to really get to know them, but you got to check out Crystavox if you haven't before. Great music. Shout. Oh my goodness. Ken Tamplin and Company. I know part of this band, at least the guitar player, came from another band that I'm going to mention a little bit later, Idle Cure. But Shout put some albums out that were just over the top, shred guitar, huge vocals, 80s, everything, massive hair, the whole deal, man. You got to check them out. And then finally, man, another one of the pioneers in this whole field, DeGarmo and Key. I was blessed to see them a couple times live. Love these guys. Huge ministry heart. Would never put them in the metal category, but they definitely rocked, and they rocked for Jesus, man. And in 1989, they came out with arguably, in my opinion, one of their top 5 albums ever, because they put out a bunch of albums. But they came out with The Pledge in that year. It was a great collection of music. I'm assuming, man, if you're watching this video, especially to this point, man, you know who DeGarmo and Key are. But if you haven't listened to The Pledge lately, go back and check it out. It is really a great album. All right, let's dive into the featured bands and albums again in no particular order. Number 1, Barren Cross. They came out with a couple really awesome albums these last couple of years of the 80s. In 88, they came out with Atomic Arena. In 1989, they came out with State of Control. In 1990, they put out a live album called Hotter Than Hell. And then we've got to round it out, man. This is where we got to dive a little bit further down into the 90s. In 94, they came out with an album called Rattle Your Cage. The thing about Barren Cross is they're just so solid, man. Their songwriting, their musicianship, the vocals, the lyrics, it's all just killer, and it's consistent, man. Whenever you click play on Barren Cross, you know what you're getting, man. You're getting great metal music for Jesus. Band number 2 is Holy Soldier. Their debut is what I would put into the category of one of the best debut albums that I know of. Their self-titled Holy Soldier album that came out in 1990, I remember when I bought this CD. It gave me hope for the 90s, man, because if you guys came up with me, you remember that in 1990, metal was kind of like dying. Grunge was becoming everything. And then Holy Soldier comes along, and they got the big hair, and they got the big sound, and they got the 80s sound, and this album is just through the roof awesome. Then in 91, they followed it up with a solid sophomore effort called Last Train. I enjoyed that album. It was good, but to me, maybe because I loved the first one so much, it just wasn't quite as good in my eyes. And then just to round things out with Holy Soldier, in 1995, they made a wrong turn, okay, just for my musical taste. They came out with Promised Man. It seemed like they kind of drank the Kool-Aid of grunge or modern rock or whatever, and they just had a different vibe. If you love that style of rock, it's good music. I'm sure you'd love it. Then in 1997, which to my understanding is the last album that they put out Encore, which was basically a best of. But man, those first two albums, the debut Holy Soldier and Last Train, if you don't have them, if you haven't listened to them, you got to check them out. Featured band number 3 is Whitecross, and you already know I love Whitecross, huge Rex Carroll fan, love Scott Wenzel. Their self-titled debut album from 1987 is one of my favorite albums of all time. And near the end of the decade of the 1980s, man, they were busy. In 1988, they released 2 albums, Hammer and Nail and Love on the Line. In 1989, they released Triumphant Return. And in 1991, in subsequent years, they came out with In the Kingdom, High Gear, Unveiled, and a few more. Whitecross has a killer discography. Maybe not quite as consistent as Barren Cross, but real close in terms of when you get a Whitecross album or you click play on a Whitecross song, you know what you're going to get, man. It's 80s metal. Featured band number 4, another monster in the Christian metal world, Bloodgood. In 1988, they released Rock in a Hard Place. In 89, they released one of my favorite Bloodgood albums, Out of the Darkness. And then, like several classic hard rock metal bands of this time period, they kind of went quiet for a little bit, and then they reemerged in the 21st century and were busy right up till the time that Michael Bloodgood passed away. They put some killer albums out around the end of the 1980s. If you love classic metal music, man, you got to check out Bloodgood's discography. Featured band number 5, Angelica. I got to thank a guy I haven't talked to in 30 plus years, but we were buds, man, my freshman year of college at Anderson University. Doug Mahalik. I remember he was from Ohio. I don't remember exactly what town. I think he was close to maybe Cedar Point, Sandusky area. Anyway, he'd come to school at Anderson. We were both guitar players, and so we hooked up. And I remember I went up to his dorm room, and this was, of course, back in the vinyl days, and he dropped the Angelica debut album on there, and I was like, oh my goodness, who is this band? Melodic, heavy, awesome riffs, great guitar player, incredible voice. That was, of course, 1989. They had just released their self-titled debut album, It's Killer. In 1990, they released Walking in the Faith. In 1991, they dropped Rock, Stock, and Barrel. And in 1992, they released Time Is All It Takes. Spent a little time kind of skipping around all those albums today, and I'm telling you, this seems to be coming up a lot. They're kind of like that Barren Cross, that Whitecross, Bloodgood's like this too. They didn't change much, man. I'm not saying they didn't grow or get better or evolve in terms of their songwriting, but their sound, they stayed true to it all the way through all of their albums. From 89 through 92, solid, melodic, hard rock, great musicianship, man. You'll love it. Check it out. Angelica. Featured band number 6 is X-Center, who burst onto the scene in the late 1980s. They brought their AC/DC style to the Christian hard rock scene. They released their debut album called Get It in 1989. They followed that up with another really solid release called Peace Treaty in 1991. And they've popped up and been active a little bit here and there between now and then. I actually saw them just this past year at Immortal Fest. They're still rocking. If you love that good straight-ahead AC/DC feel, man, with lyrics that glorify Jesus Christ and that will rock you up for him, you gotta check out X-Center. Featured band number 7, man. These guys are maestros. I love these guys. Sacred Warrior. I have always compared Sacred Warrior to kind of a cross between Iron Maiden and Queensryche. It just kind of depends on which song I'm listening to and what part of it I'm listening to. They had an incredible string of releases from 1988 to 1991. 1988, they released their debut titled Rebellion. 1989, they came out with Master's Command. In 1990, they dropped Wicked Generation. And in 1991, they blessed us with Obsessions. Man, every single one of those albums is just rock solid, virtuoso level Christian metal music. Sacred Warrior is another one of those bands that I just caught at Immortal Fest this past year, 2023. They're still rocking. They're still solid. They're great. They've put out some other recorded music over the years. If when I say a cross between Iron Maiden and Queensryche, you're like, dude, I got to check these guys out. Absolutely, you do. Check out their discography, Sacred Warrior. Featured band number 8, yeah, another band that I saw at Immortal Fest, man. There's kind of a trend here. Daniel Band. Solid Canadian Christian hard rockers. Daniel Band are another one of those bands that had a solid run from about the middle of the 1980s up through the end of the decade. From 1982, when they released their debut, On Rock, through 1986, they released 4 albums. And then in 1988, they released Running Out of Time, which to my knowledge is the last studio album they put out, okay? Again, if you got more information, drop it down in the comments. I spent a little time with Running Out of Time today listening to it, and I got to tell you, I think they just kept getting heavier as the years went on. Running Out of Time rocks from start to end, man. Riffs, solos, vocals are gritty, choruses are big, grooves are just intense. It's a great album, man. If you love classic rock that honors Jesus, man, you've got to check out Daniel Band. Featured band number 9 is Idle Cure, who I mentioned just in passing when I was going through the honorable mentions, and I talked about Shout and Ken Tamplin. The guitar player split off. There may have been some other band members who joined with Ken Tamplin to form the Shout Band. But Idle Cure put out a string of releases from the late 80s through the early 90s that were just incredible. I would categorize Idle Cure as mainstream / commercial, hard rock, and just really good. The vocals are great. The riffs are great. The guitar solos are great. The choruses are like anthemic. It's basically arena rock, man. You just want to sing with it and bang your head. They dropped their debut in 1988 called Tough Love. In 1990, they came out with Second Avenue. In 1991, they dropped Inside Out. Then in 1994, they released what I might tentatively say is my favorite Idle Cure album. It's hard for me to pick a favorite, but I love this album, man. It's called Eclipse. Featured band number 10, another one that in my opinion just got better and I would say even heavier as time went on, Leviticus. All of Leviticus's releases are solid, hard rock, borderline metal, and in 1989 they came out with what I tentatively would categorize their heaviest, man. I love this album. It's called Knights of Heaven. It's heavy, it's definitely got a metal edge, it's classic Leviticus. And as far as I know, and help me out in the comments if I get this wrong, but I think Knights of Heaven was their final release. And it's a good one, man. Check out Leviticus's discography. It's small, but it's so good. Number 11, another one of those bands with a small discography, but man, it's powerful. Messiah Prophet. In 1988, Messiah Prophet came out with their final album. It's called Colors. Classic Messiah Prophet. Great songwriting, riffs, heavy. The vocals and the choruses are killer. In the true spirit of the 80s, it is totally worth checking out. Featured band number 12, and of course, if you're part of the Pastor Brad Rocks family, this band needs no introduction. It's the Mighty Saint, one of my all-time favorites. In 1984, they came out with their debut, Warriors of the Sun. In 1986, they came out with my favorite Saint album of all time, Time's End. That's my favorite because of my story that's connected with that. You've heard that in other videos. But then in 1988, they came out with what a lot of people believe is the best album they ever released, Too Late for Living. Dee Harrington had joined with them as their lead guitar player. He is an incredible shredder. He's played on some of my stuff. I love D, great brother, and it really brought a cool vibe to the band. Too Late for Living doesn't have a skip track on it, man. It rocks from start to finish. Josh's vocals are incredible. The songwriting is just great. If you love that Saint kind of Judas Priest vibe, this album is the one to check out, Too Late for Living. By the way, just an added tidbit on Saint, they were really active all the way up through the very end of the 80s, early 90s, and then they went kind of quiet through the decade of the 90s, but then they've been active in the 21st century big time. I just saw them at Immortal Fest and they were awesome. Artist number 13, another one of those bands that was massive through the 80s, kind of disappeared through the 90s, re-emerged in the early 21st century, and they have been going non-stop. We're talking about Stryper. In 1988, they were faced with the daunting task of trying to release an album to follow up to Hell with the Devil, which was a monster release in 1986. In my opinion, I think they did a stellar job. I love this album, In God We Trust. In God We Trust has everything that Stryper fans love about Stryper. Riffs, hooks, great songwriting, incredible guitar playing, dual guitar solos, awesome vocals, harmonies, songs that bless, edify, and almost compel you to bang your head, drumming that beats through your chest. To Hell with the Devil was their #1 selling album of all time. And In God We Trust, I'm pretty sure, check me on this if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure was, and I think deservingly so, their second largest selling album of all time. In 1990 then, one they came out with, Against the Law. And if you're a Stryper fan, that always feels like kind of a dark time. I think they got burned. I think they got just really tired. And this isn't an excuse, and I've heard Michael talk about this. He doesn't make it an excuse either, but they did. They kind of banged their head against religiosity that we're kind of giving them a hard time, saying, you can't really love Jesus. You look like the world. You have long hair. You play loud music and all that stuff, and they were pioneers. They were blazing a trail, and so they were taking a lot of arrows, and I just think they got tired. They got weary. They got their eyes off the ball, and they kind of lost their way and stepped into the darkness for a little bit. And that's nothing new. Everybody knows that, or if you've listened to Michael or any of the band talk about it. So they kind of disappeared through the 90s. Each of them kind of had their solo things that they were doing. But around 2002, 2003, they found their way back together. They had found their way back to a solid place with the Lord Jesus. They were united. They went on a tour. That's the first time that I saw Stryper. My brother and I drove over to the House of Blues in Chicago. And I got to tell you, I was like a kid in a candy store. I was just like, whoa, this is just awesome. I mean, it was the very first time I saw them, and they were just incredible. There wasn't a new album out, so they were just playing all their classics. It was just awesome. Seen them several times since, and they have started cranking out albums from that point forward, and their discography is just massive. I'm kind of assuming if you're watching this video, you already know all that, but on the off chance that you just happen to drop in here and you've never heard of Christian metal, man, you gotta check out Stryper's discography. If you love metal music and you love Jesus, oh my goodness, you're gonna love it. And the last band that I want to feature came out with their debut and their final album, their only album in 1989. And I know that as soon as I make comments like that anybody that's really into Christian metal from this time, you're like, you already know who it is. Rage of Angels. Another one of those debut albums that I would put in the category of being among the very best debuts ever. Little did we know that by the time that album was finished and pressed and put on the shelves, the band had already broke up. I remember when that album came out, man, everybody was a buzz. Have you heard Rage of Angels? Oh, yeah, it's awesome. We were all talking like, when are they going to come? I wonder if we can see them live. I wonder if they'll be coming through, our state or whatever. And then little by little, we started learning, oh, wow, no, they broke up. They're already done. It's crazy. But if you haven't listened to this album, oh my goodness, it's not a big discography. It's one disc, but it is so worth checking out. And by the way, if you haven't already seen my video that I created about Rage of Angels, how they became a band, how that first album came about, how the breakup happened, I've got a video where I feature an interview with Danny Mariano, the lead singer, and he tells the story, man. I'll put the link to that video down in the description so you can check it out if you haven't already. And there you go, man. Thanks for hanging with me. If you like the video, be sure to give it a like, share it with a friend, leave those comments down there. Let me know what you thought. If you enjoyed this video, I know there's a couple others right over here that you'll really enjoy. Keep your eyes on Jesus, my friends, and I'll catch you in the next video.